Hey everyone, this is week 8, and we are looking at inequality and stratification. Let's get started. So, there are two key terms that we'll be looking at. First is social stratification, which is simply society's way of categorizing people into rankings based on various factors from wealth, income, ancestry, education, or power. And inequality usually falls from stratification, right? It's based on stratification, is how we distribute resources, opportunities, and rewards unequally. There does not mean that inequality necessarily has to be unfair. Um, for example, in a meritocratic system where people in a perfectly meritocratic system, I should say, people who work the hardest will receive the most resources, opportunities, and rewards. And most people agree that is a fair system of inequality. So those who work harder get more, those who work less get less. Uh, but we will find that inequality is not always distributed according to one's efforts, but is often based on other things. Before we get to that, though, we are going to visualize some aspects of stratification and income inequality today. So here are two examples of stratification systems. First, on the left, we have the caste system. A caste is mostly based on one's family or ancestry. We see this is a caste system of India in which you have the untouchables, which are people who are outcasts. They are the most despised or rejected in the system. Here, this is labeling them as the street sweepers or janitors. The Sudra, which are the commoners or peasants. Then above them are the merchants and landowners. Above them are the warriors, the kings, and above them are the priests and academics. On the right, we have a stratification system that we see in industrialized and capitalist economies with the working poor and people on social benefits at the bottom. And then at the top, we have the 1% and the salaried elite. So this is how society has grouped people, and based on those groupings, they may receive certain benefits or certain powers based on their place in society. Now let's see of how we can visualize income inequality. So let's imagine that every year we have all of the income that is taken, and it is visualized in these $100 bills. Okay, so the $100 bills here each represent 1/100th of the total income of the US. And then on the left and right, we have split up the population of the US into 6 categories. We have the poorest fifth, so this is the bottom 20% of the US economy, or of the US population, the 20 to 40th percentiles, the middle quintile, which is those who are in the 40 to 60th percent of their wealth, the 60 to 80th percentile, the rich, which are the 80 to 99th percentile, and then the top 1%. And what we're going to see is what percentage of the entire US income is distributed amongst these different groups. If there was perfect equality, we would expect that each quintile, so each 20%, would receive 20% of that income. But since there is not perfect equality, we are going to see how the money is distributed. So in 2020, the poorest quintile, so among the lowest 20% of the US population, they were able to take 3.8% of the US money. The second quintile took in 8.9% of the US income. So that's far lower than a perfectly equal 20%. The third quintile, so this is the kind of the middle class took in only 13.6% of the US economy's income. Then the fourth quintile, so this is the second highest quintile, took in about their equal share, quote unquote. They took in about 20%. And then the rich quintile, so this is the top 20% besides the 1%, took in 38.5%. So quite the large share. And the top 1% took in 15.8%. So the top 20% together, that's the 80 to 99th percentile plus the 1%, brought in about 54% of the US economy's money. The rest of so less than half went to 80% of the US. So that shows how unequal the US economy is, and it is one of the most, if not the most, unequal economically nation in the Western world. So among other industrialized economies, including Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. So what are the consequences of income inequality? How does this work in today's society? So we want to look at mobility. That's usually how we think of consequences of income inequality is if your status, if you were born into a poor family, is it fair if you are only able to stay poor, or should you be able to move up and down the economic ladder? So should your parents' class define your class? So economic mobility is discussed in two ways. The first is whether or not you have intra-generational mobility, which is whether or not you can start poor and then end up rich. Or there's intergenerational mobility, which is whether or not you can have a different class or economic status than your parents. That's intergenerational mobility. So economic mobility is, in a way, it shows us how inequality exists. And what we want to look at as sociologists is if this inequality or the barriers to economic mobility are because of achieved or ascribed characteristics. So ascribed characteristics are things you cannot choose, and usually that you are born with, whether this is your gender, your race, your parents' income or class, your nationality, your geography of where you were born, your neighborhood. And then achieved characteristics are something you develop. So your hard work, your skills, or your learning. Again, as we've talked about in a meritocratic system, we would hope that the stratification or the inequality is based on your achieved characteristics. But what we're going to look at next is how inequality might be based on ascribed characteristics. Before we get to that, we're going to look at what kind of resources might be distributed through a society. There are 8 main ones that sociologists look at. The first is economic, and this is largely just wealth, income, or home ownership. So how much money do you own or how much wealth do you have? There is political resource, which is how much power can you wield over a family, over a business, or over a country, etc. There's cultural resources, which is the knowledge or the know-how. So how do you act in society? What are the norms that you follow? Social resources are your connections in your network. So who do you know? Are they people with useful resources and people who can help you move up in the world? Honorific resources are titles or prizes. Do you have recognition among your social group? Do people admire you? Civil resources are whether or not you have citizenship or rights in a certain area. So are you restricted from working? Do you have freedom of speech? Do you have an ID card? Human resources are any education or training that you might have, and what kind of jobs they could get you. And then your physical or mental resources, which strength, health, are you alive? Because if you are not, then it's hard to get resources. Are you healthy? Etc. Sociologists look at 8 core areas and questions of inequality. We'll go through these pretty quickly. So first, how does inequality function, or how does it create dysfunction? So when does it provide incentives for innovation and work? This is a common defense of American inequality today, is if there was no inequality, would people work hard enough to get to the top? Or does inequality disrupt or harm innovation? If we made it more equal, would there be more innovation? Second, sociologists might look at the comparison of inequality across countries, time periods, political systems, etc. They might look at how inequality is structured. So again, this is the social stratification. How does an inequality affect the structure of a society? Which groups are able to get ahead? Which groups are able to hold power? They might focus on different groupings that in an unequal society. So here we might look at the ruling class or the elites. This is something that C. Wright Mills focused on. We read him in the first week of class. Who are they? What resources do they have? Why are they the elite? We might look at the other side. We might look at people in poverty or the underclass. Why are they in poverty? What keeps them in poverty? Are they able to leave? So what are the mechanisms that help people get ahead? Who are able to get the best jobs or get into the best schools? What is mobility? And then we might look at ascribed characteristics and how they affect inequality. And largely in the US, we have looked at race and gender. So we want to look at specifically I wanted to give you these definitions, that stratification is the ordering of different groupings, and inequality is the degree to which resources are not uniformly distributed across groups of people. Now we are going to transition to a different slideshow, which I apologize, because they are in different presentations that I didn't mean to do that. But we are going to look at how or the consequences of income inability and how they affect us. This you can get from the New York Times. It is a piece called The Punishing Effects of Racism, and it looks at how income inequality by race affects the chances of young men. So let me share this presentation real fast. Here we go. So, if you start rich, do you stay rich? In this New York Times article, they looked at 10,000 boys in this instance who grew up in rich families and saw where they ended up. We would ideally see both races grouped into 20% segments again. So regardless of where you started, if it was a perfectly meritocratic society, we would probably see that 20% of rich people stayed rich, 20% of rich boys went into the middle class, 20% became poor. But we see that there is not a perfectly equal society, that 39% of rich white boys stay rich when they become adults, whereas only 17% of black boys remain rich. Here's another way of visualizing it. So if we had 100% equal economic mobility, regardless of where you started, you would have an equal chance of being rich, going to the upper middle class, lower middle class, or a poor adult. So if we had 100 people, 20 would stay rich, 20 would become upper middle class, 20 would go to the middle class, then 20 to the lower middle class, and 20 to the poor adults. But what we see is that for rich black boys, when they become adults, only about 17% are rich adults, about 19% are upper middle class, 22% are middle class, 20% are lower middle class, and 22% are poor adults. So this is almost what you would expect in 100% equal economic mobility. So we kind of see that for Black men, their class does not necessarily determine where they will end up. However, for rich white boys, we see that 39% of them will stay rich, 24 will be in the upper middle class, only 16 will fall to the middle class, and only 10% will fall each to the lower middle class and the poor adults. So for white boys, wealth actually is quite a protector. Your family's wealth is quite a protector for you to stay rich as you get older. Now, what about the reverse? What about poor children? So again, we would expect that if there was equal mobility and economic opportunity, that there would be 20% of that poor children would have a 20% chance of fitting in any of these groupings of rich, upper middle class, lower middle class, and poor. However, what we see is something different. For white boys, we have about only 10% of them become rich. 16% of poor white boys become upper middle class. 20 become middle class, 23 become lower middle class, and 31 stay poor. So we see that most of them still are in poverty. It's even worse for Black boys who are born in poverty. 48, almost half, will stay poor. 28% will move up into the lower middle class. 15% will move into the middle class. Only 6% will move into the upper middle class, and 2% move into the rich category. So this shows that race and class are big influences on our abilities to have economic mobility. Again, if we had perfect economic mobility, perfect equal opportunity, what we would see is something in the middle. But because we have a system that is stratified on race, class, gender, and other norms and categories, we do not see this. Okay, that's the end of the lecture for week 8. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great spring break. Thanks, everyone.